It was an ordinary morning at the city courthouse. Judge Jonathan Harris had arrived early as usual with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He made his way through the crowded hallways, past the rows of busy clerks and bustling lawyers, all preparing for their cases of the day. The courtrooms were alive with chatter as people argued over details of lawsuits. Defendants and plaintiffs nervously awaited their turn. The sound of footsteps echoed off the cold marble floors, adding to the urgency of the scene for Harris. It was just another day of business as usual. He had seen it all, from traffic violations to high-profile corporate disputes. The job had its routine, but nothing ever really surprised him. As he settled into his chair behind the large wooden bench, the case list for the day was passed along to him. As he scanned the names and offenses, it was clear this would be a fairly simple day. Most of the defendants were ordinary people dealing with minor infractions and small fines, but there was one name that caught his eye: Vanessa Turner. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but the details were unclear. The case involved a violation of zoning laws. It appeared that Turner had expanded her business's office space without the necessary permits or paperwork, an offense that many local business owners had been caught committing in recent months. When the time came for her case, Vanessa entered the courtroom with a calm grace that caught the judge's attention. She was dressed in a modest yet professional suit, her dark hair pulled back neatly into a bun. Her expression was serious, but not panicked. She stood in front of the bench without hesitation, but her eyes held something the judge couldn't quite place: an air of quiet confidence, yet at the same time a sense of restraint, as if she were perfectly aware of the weight of the situation, but unwilling to show weakness. Harris studied her for a moment before beginning the proceedings. The case seemed straightforward enough. The facts were clear. Vanessa had made an illegal expansion to her office space. She had violated city regulations and now had to face the consequences. Her lawyer argued for leniency, claiming that it had been an honest mistake and that Vanessa was not aware of the full extent of the zoning laws. The judge listened, but remained unimpressed. Turning his attention to Vanessa, Harris asked her if she had anything to add. She looked up, meeting his gaze without faltering. "I understand the violation, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "I accept responsibility for the actions taken and will comply with any consequences. I'm not asking for special treatment. I simply want to resolve this matter as swiftly as possible." Her words were simple, but they carried an unspoken strength. Her demeanor was calm, professional, but there was something behind her eyes of quiet intensity that suggested there was much more to her than met the eye. Harris found himself briefly distracted by this presence. He wasn't used to seeing such composure in the defendants, who often fidgeted nervously or tried to argue their way out of trouble. With no further argument to be made, the judge ruled swiftly, imposing a substantial fine on Vanessa Turner for the violation, a standard penalty for cases like hers. She accepted the fine without protest, signing the paperwork without hesitation. Harris made his final remarks and dismissed her from the courtroom. The whole thing felt so routine, so ordinary, but there was something about her that lingered in the judge's mind as he moved on to the next case. Vanessa Turner walked out of the courthouse with a purposeful stride, her heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement as she headed toward her car parked in the lot just outside the building. She didn't pause to look back at the courthouse behind her, its looming structure nothing more than a brief stop on her long journey. The fine was nothing she couldn't handle, and the judge's ruling, though large, wasn't the real issue. Her mind was already racing, calculating the next steps, thinking of how to manage the implications for her company and its future. Vanessa had faced far worse challenges than this small legal hiccup. As the CEO of Turner Enterprises, one of the fastest-growing tech firms in the region, she was no stranger to the intricacies of business regulations. She'd spent years navigating the complex landscape of corporate law, always ensuring that her company complied with every zoning law, tax code, and environmental guideline. Until now, the expansion had been an oversight, one she hadn't personally approved, but that had slipped through the cracks during a particularly busy quarter. She had already told her legal team to handle it, and they had assured her they would sort it out. The fine would be paid, and the company would move forward. No time to dwell. As she slid into the leather seat of her car, Vanessa picked up her phone and quickly scrolled through a few messages. Her assistant had sent over updates on upcoming board meetings, potential mergers, and a few investor inquiries. A new software release was on the horizon, and her head of development had sent a draft of the launch strategy. It was the kind of fast-paced environment she thrived in, always moving, always thinking 2 steps ahead. The judge and his fine were nothing compared to the larger picture she had to manage. Her car sped toward the company headquarters, a sleek glass building standing tall in the heart of the business district. As the vehicle pulled into the parking garage, Vanessa's mind shifted focus to the larger responsibility of leading Turner Enterprises. The company had been built from the ground up, starting as a small software startup with a handful of employees in a cramped office space. Now it spanned multiple continents with thousands of employees, revolutionizing industries with cutting-edge technology. Vanessa was at the helm, but the pressure never eased. Every decision she made rippled out to affect thousands of lives, from the engineers in her labs to the customers relying on her products. Every mistake, no matter how small, could lead to consequences far beyond just paying a fine. Once inside the building, Vanessa was greeted by her assistant, Claire, who handed her a folder filled with reports and updates. "The meeting with the investors is set for 3, Claire said, following her into the elevator. Also, the legal team sent over some documents regarding the zoning fine. They're working on minimizing the impact." Vanessa nodded absently, flipping through the papers in her hands. "I'm not worried about it. Just make sure we handle it quietly. We can't afford to let this get out of hand." Her voice was calm, as always. She knew that if the story got into the press, it could create unnecessary distractions. She arrived at her office on the top floor and immediately dove into the day's work. The next few hours were a blur of meetings, strategy sessions, and conference calls. Her team kept the ship moving smoothly, and Vanessa's decisions, while often split-second, were sharp and calculated. She rarely allowed herself to be caught off guard, always maintaining an air of control and competence. But even as she signed off on reports and approved new product designs, her mind kept drifting back to the courtroom, back to Judge Jonathan Harris. His face, though fleeting in her memory, had left an impression. It wasn't just the way he had looked at her during the trial, almost as if trying to figure her out. It was the way he had delivered the verdict. So calm, so definitive. Vanessa wondered if he knew who she really was, or if he just saw her as another faceless defendant. She could almost hear his voice in her head again as he had handed down the fine. No special treatment. He probably thought she was just another businesswoman who had gotten tangled in the web of bureaucracy. Little did he know the woman he had just fined was one of the most powerful people in the business world. But to Vanessa, that didn't matter. It never had. For her, this was just another small battle in the war of corporate life, and she had long learned how to win those. Weeks passed since the court ruling, and Vanessa's life continued at its usual relentless pace. The fine was settled without fanfare, buried beneath the weight of hundreds of other tasks. Turner Enterprises was expanding faster than ever, and the competition was fierce. Vanessa knew that every day in business was a race, and in that race, the only thing that mattered was staying ahead. Yet, as she moved through her world of boardrooms, conference calls, and product launches, one small event kept nagging at her. A brief moment in the courthouse, standing before Judge Jonathan Harris. It wasn't the fine itself, it was the judgment, the steady gaze from a man who had no idea who she truly was. It was unsettling, though she would never admit it. Then, one evening, a chance encounter would change everything. Vanessa had been invited to attend a high-profile charity gala at the city's most luxurious hotel. It was a networking event for the city's elite. CEOs, influential investors, and philanthropists would be in attendance. Vanessa had no intention of being there, but it was one of those events you couldn't afford to miss. It was an opportunity to forge connections, to showcase the power of Turner Enterprises, and maybe even secure the kind of investment that could catapult the company to the next level. The venue was dazzling. Crystal chandeliers, a grand piano playing softly in the corner, and waiters offering champagne on silver trays. Vanessa walked through the crowded ballroom, her presence commanding the room. She wasn't flashy, but her elegance was undeniable. Dressed in a sleek black dress with minimal jewelry, she exuded confidence, and people instinctively parted as she moved through the crowd. Her assistant Claire was by her side, helping navigate the social minefield. Vanessa's eyes scanned the room, evaluating potential partners and allies, mentally categorizing each person as she exchanged polite greetings. As they made their way toward the main stage for the opening speech, Vanessa felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find a man standing there tall, with neatly combed hair and a suit that clearly belonged to someone accustomed to power. For a moment, Vanessa thought he was a businessman she had met before, but then his eyes narrowed slightly in recognition. "Vanessa Turner?" he asked as though uncertain. She smiled politely. "Yes, that's me." The man's eyes flickered with realization, and she saw the recognition in his face. "I knew I'd seen you before," he said. "You're the CEO of Turner Enterprises, right?" Vanessa's smile remained calm, but inside, she was taken aback. "That's right," she replied, nodding. But then, something unusual happened. The man's eyes softened, and he stepped back slightly as though he was seeing her in a new light. "I'm Judge Jonathan Harris," he said, offering his hand. "You might not remember me, but I presided over your case a few weeks ago." For a split second, the world seemed to pause. Vanessa's mind raced. Judge Harris asterisk, the man who had fined her so bluntly, without hesitation. The man who had seen her as just another business owner caught in the web of regulation. He didn't seem to recognize her in the same way she recognized him. For him, she was just another defendant. For her, he was the one who had handed down a judgment that, in her world, seemed out of place. She took his hand, smiling warmly. "Of course, I remember," she said, her voice even though her mind was already working through the implications. "I'm surprised to see you here." Jonathan chuckled lightly, his eyes scanning the room. "I never expected to meet you again in a setting like this, that's for sure. I didn't know you moved in these circles." Vanessa's smile tightened, but she held her composure. "I suppose that's the funny thing about life," she said. "You never really know who you'll run into." As the conversation shifted to polite small talk, Vanessa couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. Judge Harris, standing there in his suit, was just as composed as he had been in the courtroom. But there was something different about him now. The stiff formality of the courtroom was gone, replaced by the more relaxed social environment of the gala. It was strange, and for a brief moment, she wondered if he had the slightest inkling of who she truly was. But Vanessa pushed the thought aside. She wasn't here for a reunion. This gala was about building her future, not revisiting her past. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter with Judge Harris had planted a seed. There was something more to this, something that would unfold in ways neither of them could predict. The encounter with Judge Jonathan Harris lingered in Vanessa's mind long after the gala ended. She found herself reflecting on the brief exchange, analyzing the judge's reaction, and wondering whether he had recognized the weight of his previous decision. The evening had been filled with more pressing matters, but the unexpected meeting with the judge seemed to press itself into her thoughts, almost as if fate were nudging her towards something deeper. Meanwhile, Judge Harris returned to his daily routine, his life moving forward in the same steady manner as before. However, the face of Vanessa Turner haunted his thoughts in ways he hadn't anticipated. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than the simple businesswoman who had appeared before him in court. Something about the way she carried herself, so composed, so self-assured, had made him question his initial assessment. He couldn't recall many details from their courtroom exchange, but he knew he had handed down a hefty fine without a second thought. He had treated her like just another defendant, not knowing the full story behind the woman standing before him. In the days that followed, Judge Harris became increasingly curious about Vanessa. He spent his evenings scrolling through news articles, financial reports, and social media profiles, trying to piece together the story of Turner Enterprises and its enigmatic CEO. What he discovered shocked him. Vanessa Turner was no ordinary businesswoman. She was a force to be reckoned with. Turner Enterprises, the company she had built from the ground up, was not just a successful tech firm, it was a global powerhouse with billions in revenue. The company's innovations spanned industries from artificial intelligence to cybersecurity, and its influence reached far beyond the local market. Vanessa was the mastermind behind it all. She wasn't just a leader, she was a disruptor, someone who had changed the very fabric of the tech industry. Under her leadership, Turner Enterprises had grown exponentially, acquiring smaller startups and pioneering cutting-edge technologies that had made her a household name in the corporate world. Judge Harris sat in disbelief as he read through the articles detailing Vanessa's rise to success. Her name had appeared in numerous business magazines and media outlets. She was often featured in stories about female empowerment in business, lauded for her ability to navigate the complexities of running a global company while balancing her personal life. But it wasn't just her business achievements that struck him. It was the realization that he had, unknowingly, find one of the most influential people in the world. The weight of this discovery hit him hard. He had handed down a decision that, in retrospect, seemed almost trivial when placed against the backdrop of Vanessa's vast empire. How had he missed this? How had he not known who she was when she stood before him in that courtroom? He couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt for the way he had handled the situation. His ruling had been stern, without the benefit of understanding the full scope of the woman standing before him. He had seen the legal facts, the violation of zoning laws, but he hadn't taken into account the bigger picture. It was a sobering thought. How many other people with stories and lives far more complicated than the ones presented in court had he judged without truly understanding their circumstances? His professional detachment had always been a point of pride, but now, for the first time, he began to wonder if it had caused him to miss the nuances of the human stories behind the cases. Judge Harris sat at his desk, staring at the screen in front of him, lost in thought. The fine he had imposed on Vanessa seemed so insignificant now. He didn't know what he expected to do with this newfound information, what action he could take, but he knew one thing for certain. Vanessa Turner was not just another defendant. She was a woman of incredible power, and now he had a chance to see beyond the courtroom's sterile boundaries. The question was, would she ever allow him to make amends? A week passed since Judge Jonathan Harris' discovery about Vanessa Turner, and it weighed heavily on his mind. He knew that the fine he had imposed was a mere drop in the ocean of what she had built, yet something still gnawed at him. It wasn't just the fact that she was a corporate giant. It was the realization that he had treated her as though she were just another person caught in the gears of bureaucracy, without truly understanding who she was or the impact she had on the world around her. Harris spent his days in the courtroom and his nights in reflection, wondering if there was any way to address the dissonance between his professional detachment and the growing sense that he had misjudged Vanessa. He had done his job, delivered the verdict, but it now felt hollow. In the silence of his office, he made the decision. He had to reach out to her. He wasn't sure what he could say, or even if she wanted to hear from him, but something told him that he had to at least try. That very afternoon, just as he was about to head home, his phone rang. Surprised, he answered without checking the caller ID. Judge Harris, a calm, confident voice greeted him. It was Vanessa. "Good afternoon, Judge," she said. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat, and he immediately stood up from his desk, his pulse quickening. He had expected nothing like this. "Miss Turner, it's a pleasure to hear from you. How can I help?" He tried to keep his voice steady, though his mind was racing. "I wanted to take a moment to thank you for your professionalism in our case," she said, her tone warm but formal. "I know that for someone in your position, this kind of matter may seem like a small issue, just another case to process, but I appreciated the way you handled it. You were efficient and fair." Harris blinked in surprise, unsure of what to say. He had expected an entirely different kind of conversation, perhaps one in which she expressed anger or resentment. But here she was, being gracious, almost disarming. I'm glad to hear that," he said, choosing his words carefully. "But if I may be honest, I've been thinking a lot about the case, and I realize now that there's a lot more to you and your work than I'd understood at the time." Vanessa was silent for a moment, and Harris could almost hear her considering her next words. Finally, she spoke. "You're right," she said. There's a lot more to me than meets the eye. I think in that moment, you saw a business owner, someone who made a mistake. But what you may not have known is that I also carry a responsibility to thousands of employees, to investors, and to the communities that depend on the work we do. I never make decisions lightly, Judge. Harris' chest tightened. He felt a deep respect for her honesty, and it was clear that Vanessa wasn't just a typical defendant. She was a visionary, someone with an unshakable commitment to her company and the people within it. I understand that now, he replied, his voice tinged with humility. I should have considered the larger context before making my decision. I made a judgment without fully grasping the situation. Vanessa's tone softened, and there was a pause on the other end. Judge Harris, I don't hold that against you. The system is designed to be objective, and you acted according to the facts in front of you. But I want you to know that it wasn't an easy decision for me to make either. I didn't want this to become an issue, but sometimes, in business, things slip through the cracks. I'm not perfect. I'm just doing the best I can. Her words struck a chord with him, and for the first time, Jonathan felt the weight of the gap between his profession and the lives of the people who passed through his courtroom. He realized that the decisions he made, while legal and just, often lacked the understanding that human lives, complex, multifaceted, and powerful, were at the core of every case. Vanessa continued, her voice now more introspective. I wanted to extend an invitation to you, Judge. I know you've been curious about who I am and what I do. How about joining me for lunch sometime? We can talk. You can ask all the questions you want. Harris was taken aback by her offer. It wasn't often that someone with Vanessa's stature reached out in such a personal way. I'd be honored, he said. I'd like that very much. Great, Vanessa replied, her tone genuine. I'll have my assistant arrange it. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me today, Judge. As the call ended, Jonathan sat back in his chair, a mix of disbelief and curiosity swirling in his mind. He had expected nothing but a brief, polite exchange, but what he had just experienced was something far deeper, a chance for understanding, for growth, and perhaps for redemption. Vanessa Turner, it seemed, was far more than just the businesswoman he had once judged, and now he had the opportunity to learn who she truly was. The days that followed were a blur for Judge Jonathan Harris. The unexpected call from Vanessa Turner had unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He couldn't stop thinking about their conversation and the invitation she had extended. He had spent his entire career in the world of law, where logic and procedure governed every decision. But this felt different. There was something about Vanessa's openness, her ability to see beyond the confines of a courtroom, that intrigued him. By the time the lunch date arrived, Jonathan had spent several sleepless nights considering the implications of meeting her. He was a judge, and in his role, impartiality was everything. But now, here he was, about to sit down with one of the most influential women in the business world, someone whose name carried weight far beyond the walls of his courtroom. The lunch was set at a sleek, upscale restaurant in the heart of the city, a place where the business elite often gathered. When Jonathan arrived, Vanessa was already there, seated at a table by the window, her back straight, exuding the same quiet confidence he had noticed in the courthouse weeks ago. She looked effortlessly elegant in a tailored suit, her hair neatly styled, and as she spotted him entering, she rose with a warm smile. Judge Harris, she greeted him, extending her hand. I'm glad you could make it. Jonathan returned the smile, shaking her hand firmly. Thank you for inviting me, Miss Turner. This place looks incredible. Vanessa gestured for him to sit. Please call me Vanessa, she said as she resumed her seat. I'm happy to have you here. As the waiter brought over the menus, the two of them exchanged pleasantries. Nothing heavy, just the usual introductions and small talk. Jonathan, still feeling the weight of the situation, found himself searching for the right words. But Vanessa, as always, had a way of putting people at ease. You must be wondering why I invited you here, she said, her voice calm and matter-of-fact. Jonathan nodded, surprised by how quickly she cut to the chase. I admit, I've been curious. I wasn't expecting this, but I'm glad to be here. Vanessa gave a knowing smile. It's not often that people in my position take time to sit down with someone like you. But after our call, I thought maybe you and I could have an honest conversation about more than just the case you ruled on." Jonathan leaned forward slightly, intrigued. "I'd like that. I think it's important to have these kinds of conversations." Vanessa's eyes softened. "In my world, everything is driven by results. People are judged constantly based on their performance, their decisions, their successes. But rarely do we stop to consider the human side of the equation. It's easy to forget that behind every success story, there's a person facing challenges, making mistakes, and trying to grow." Jonathan absorbed her words, feeling a sense of understanding settle within him. For the first time, he felt that his own job, his work in the courtroom, was being scrutinized in a different light. He had always considered himself a fair and objective judge, but now he began to question whether he truly understood the complexity of the cases he presided over. "Tell me," Vanessa continued, "how do you see your role as a judge? Do you ever think about the people behind the cases, or is it always just about the law and the facts?" Jonathan paused, considering the question carefully. "I've always believed that my job is to remain impartial, to look at the law, the facts, and to make the best decision based on what's presented to me. But I'll admit, lately, I've been wondering if there's more to it than that. Maybe I've been too focused on procedure without really considering the broader picture. It's something I'm still grappling with." Vanessa nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. As a CEO, I'm often faced with decisions that affect not just my company, but the lives of thousands of people. And I'm not always right. But I try to look at the bigger picture to consider the long-term consequences. I think the same should apply to judges. Every decision you make impacts someone's life." For a moment, there was silence between them. Jonathan felt a shift, a deeper understanding between them. Vanessa wasn't just a businesswoman defending her company. She was someone who understood the weight of responsibility, the pressure of making decisions that could change lives. "You know, when I first met you in court," Jonathan said, his voice thoughtful, "I didn't understand who you were or the context of your situation. I simply saw a violation of the law. But now, I realize that I may have missed something important." Vanessa smiled slightly. "It's easy to make judgments based on surface-level information. But the truth is, we're all more complicated than that. We all have our stories, our struggles." Their conversation continued, weaving between business, life, and the complexities of the decisions that shaped both of their worlds. By the time the lunch came to a close, Jonathan felt like he had gained more insight into Vanessa Turner and into himself than he had expected. As they stood to leave, Vanessa extended her hand again. "Thank you, Judge," she said. "I'm glad we could have this conversation. It's been enlightening." Jonathan shook her hand firmly. "Thank you, Vanessa. I think I've learned more today than I have in a long time." The days following the lunch with Vanessa Turner seemed to pass in a blur for Judge Jonathan Harris. The conversation had been far more revealing than he had expected, and he found himself reflecting on it at every turn. It wasn't just that he had met someone with immense power and influence. It was the realization that, for the first time in a long while, he had been forced to reconsider his worldview. In his career, Jonathan had prided himself on his ability to remain detached, to treat each case with the cold objectivity that the law demanded. But as he thought back to their discussion, he began to question whether that approach was truly sufficient. The law was meant to serve people, but had he, in his pursuit of fairness and efficiency, been blind to the human stories behind the cases? Vanessa had been a stark reminder of the complexity of every individual life. For the first time, Jonathan wondered if he had been so focused on the process that he had lost sight of the bigger picture. The idea that each person who entered his courtroom was more than just a case number, that they carried with them a unique set of circumstances and a set of values. He had always known this, but he hadn't truly understood it until now. It wasn't just about Vanessa. He started to consider all the other people who had appeared before him over the years, the ones he had ruled over with the same detached professionalism. Had he ever really considered their stories, their motives, their struggles? Had he ever truly tried to understand the pressures they faced, the challenges that might have led them to make the decisions they did. The more Jonathan thought about it, the more he felt a sense of responsibility, both to the law and to the people he served. He had always believed in the importance of maintaining a strict adherence to the law, but now he saw how crucial it was to also acknowledge the human element. He didn't need to abandon his commitment to justice, but perhaps, he thought, he could bring a more compassionate perspective to his work. As the weeks passed, Jonathan began to notice a shift in his approach to his cases. He found himself listening more intently, paying closer attention to the nuances of each situation, trying to look beyond the facts and into the hearts of those involved. He became more mindful of the pressures people faced in their personal and professional lives, realizing that sometimes those pressures could shape decisions in ways that weren't immediately obvious. It was a slow transformation, one that unfolded quietly within him. But Jonathan noticed the changes in himself. He became more patient with defendants, more empathetic in his rulings, and more willing to seek alternative solutions when the circumstances allowed. He had once prided himself on being a no-nonsense judge, someone who followed the law to the letter. But now he began to see the power of nuance, the importance of understanding the context in which a person made their choices. Vanessa, meanwhile, continued her work with Turner Enterprises. The company's growth showed no signs of slowing down, and her influence in the business world only continued to grow. However, the encounter with Judge Harris had left an impression on her as well. She had expected a simple transactional meeting, a quick resolution of her feelings about the fine. But instead, she had found herself in a deep, reflective conversation, one that challenged both of them to think about their roles in a new way. Vanessa had always seen the world through the lens of business, focusing on results, strategy, and success. But after her lunch with Jonathan, she began to consider the broader impact of her decisions. She had always been a driven leader, but the weight of leadership was often more than she had allowed herself to fully acknowledge. She realized that every decision she made, every strategy she implemented, affected not only her employees and investors, but also the communities they served. The stakes were always high, and sometimes the choices were not as clear-cut as she had believed. While Vanessa's career continued to soar, she found herself reaching out to more people, leaders from different industries, individuals with different perspectives. It wasn't about building a network for the sake of advancement anymore. It was about building connections that could help her lead with more empathy, with a greater sense of responsibility. She had begun to view her role not just as a business leader, but as a mentor, a guide, someone who could influence the future in a more meaningful way. One day, as she sat in her office overlooking the city, Vanessa found herself reflecting on her unexpected relationship with Judge Harris. The way their paths had crossed in such an ordinary, almost mundane way had led to something far deeper. They had both walked away from their meeting with a newfound awareness, a shift in how they viewed the world and their roles within it. She thought about how they both had become more thoughtful in their actions, Jonathan in the courtroom, Vanessa in her business dealings, and how the power of a simple conversation had sparked that change. As she prepared for yet another round of meetings and decisions, Vanessa realized that, like Jonathan, she too was evolving. The world of business and the world of law may have seemed worlds apart, but their shared humanity had brought them closer than either could have imagined. In that quiet, unspoken connection, they had both found something that went beyond their professions. They had found a new way to see the world, a way that was more compassionate, more aware, and, ultimately, more just. Months passed since Judge Jonathan Harris and Vanessa Turner's pivotal lunch. Both had continued their lives, but something fundamental had changed within them. The lessons they had learned from each other resonated in their work, their decisions, and in the way they viewed the world. For Jonathan, the courtroom had become a place of reflection. He found himself less eager to hand down quick judgments and more willing to take the time to understand the context behind the cases he ruled on. His colleagues had noticed a shift in him, one that was subtle but profound. The sharp, unyielding judge they had once known had softened, becoming more empathetic without sacrificing his commitment to justice. It was as if, for the first time in years, he was truly seeing the people behind the cases, the lives that were impacted by his decisions. One day, after a particularly intense trial involving a small business owner struggling to keep his family run company afloat, Jonathan found himself questioning the fairness of a decision he was about to make. The case involved a legal dispute over unpaid taxes, but there were nuances that went beyond the numbers: personal struggles, an ailing spouse, and mounting debts. Jonathan hesitated. This wasn't just a case about law, it was about human lives, about choices made in desperation. He found himself considering alternatives, ways to help the man avoid a penalty that could ruin everything he had worked for. It was a difficult decision, but one that felt right. The balance between fairness and compassion, which Vanessa had so subtly introduced him to, was now a guiding principle in his mind. Outside the courtroom, Vanessa's world had grown even more complex. Turner Enterprises was thriving, its reach expanding globally. Yet the higher she rose in the corporate world, the more she understood the responsibility that came with her position. She had once viewed business as a battlefield, a place where only the strongest survived. But after her conversation with Jonathan, she began to see it through a more nuanced lens. Leadership, she realized, was not just about driving success. It was about uplifting others, about creating opportunities, and fostering an environment of mutual respect. Vanessa was no longer content to simply be a business mogul. She had become an advocate for ethical practices in the corporate world. She introduced mentorship programs within her company, empowering younger employees to rise through the ranks based on skill and merit, rather than simply connections or seniority. She implemented policies aimed at improving employee welfare, knowing that a strong company wasn't built on profits alone, but on the people who made it work. Her transformation from a business-minded executive to a compassionate leader was a direct result of the reflections Jonathan had sparked within her. Their paths crossed again one fateful evening at a charity gala, this time with no courtroom, no legal disputes hanging in the air. Vanessa had organized the event, a fundraiser for underprivileged youth, and Jonathan had been invited as a guest of honor. Their brief, polite interactions over the months had now grown into something more meaningful. When they finally saw each other across the crowded room, their eyes met with recognition, a silent acknowledgement that their lives had been changed by that one unexpected meeting. Vanessa approached Jonathan with a smile, the same calm confidence she had always carried. "Judge Harris," she greeted, her voice warm. "Vanessa," Jonathan replied, a hint of admiration in his tone. "It's good to see you again." The conversation flowed easily between them, a natural extension of the bond they had forged months ago. As they spoke, Jonathan realized how much he had come to respect her, not just as a business leader, but as a person. Vanessa had done more than change his approach to the law. She had reminded him of the importance of humanity, of the impact that even the smallest gesture could have on someone's life. "You know," Vanessa said after a while, "I've been thinking a lot about the lessons we learned from each other. I used to see business as a game of winning or losing, but now I see it as something more." She paused, searching his eyes. "It's about making a real difference, about guiding people, not just through financial success, but through growth and understanding." Jonathan nodded, deeply moved. "And I've come to realize that my job isn't just about delivering verdicts. It's about seeing the whole person, not just the case. The law might provide a framework, but it's compassion that helps us understand the true meaning of justice." For a moment, there was silence between them, a shared understanding hanging in the air. They both knew that they had come full circle. One had started as a simple courtroom encounter, followed by an unexpected meeting, had led to something much deeper than either of them had anticipated. It was a lesson in empathy, in understanding the human side of decisions, and in recognizing that sometimes the most profound changes come not from the rules, but from the connections we make with others. As the night wore on, Jonathan and Vanessa continued to talk, no longer just two people from different worlds, but two individuals who had found common ground in their desire to make the world a little more just, a little more humane. Their journey had begun with a fine and a judgment, but it had blossomed into a friendship built on respect and shared understanding. And as they parted ways that evening, they knew that whatever came next in their respective worlds, They would continue to carry the lessons they had learned from each other. The fine was long forgotten, but the impact of their encounter would last a lifetime.